There are several ways to skin a cat, or a taxpayer for that matter. When it comes to taxation, there are different ways of doing it to allow the impact to be less on the economy rather than more. And statistics have found that when you tax a person a certain amount of money, the tax coming into the taxpayer actually goes down rather than up, especially when taxing the wealthy, because they need to deal with their money in such a way that it is not taxed in, which means that the economic value from that tax disappears and less comes into the fiscus. South Africa's taxation is well above the level at which it's profitable to tax for a government. And most recently, instead of adjusting for inflation when it came to tax brackets, they left the tax brackets where they were, which meant that yet more tax would come into the coffers of the state. And unfortunately, that's not really what really happens, is it? Because if you tax on more than they should be taxed, you actually get less because it stifles the economy and it encourages bad economic behavior. And we continue to have a problem of lack of tax collection. Now the government's done many other things to try and collect taxes. You've seen VAT raised. Problem with raising value-added tax, or VAT as some call it, is that it makes everything more expensive, which means there's less which can be done in the country economically. Something else which also has had that impact is e-tolls. If you eat out at a restaurant in Gauteng province where e-tolls exist, it's far more expensive than eating out in a restaurant in, say, KwaZulu-Natal. These sort of things add onto the struggle, really, of ordinary people. You then have petrol. In some countries, they will in fact subsidize petrol because they know that subsidizing petrol means that all products become cheaper. It becomes easier to do business when petrol is cheaper. And yet, the South African approach is to put approximately a 1/3 tax on petrol. A third of every rand you spend on petrol goes to taxation. It had better be important taxation, hadn't it, if we are in fact making everything more expensive for everyone, including the poor. Not just because they need to use taxis or other cheap transportation, but because their food does as well, and books do, and computers do, and everything that goes around needs that. Well, it seems that that's not the way in which government views it, because what we have is a 1/3 tax on petrol. Botswana buys petrol from South Africa and spends a lot less per litre of petrol because of the lack of taxation on this very important everyday item. And the result is clear when you go out onto the street and meet people. They are struggling because of the high petrol price. They are struggling because of high inflation. And both of these are the result of an unfortunate tax system. Another thing which unfortunately affects taxation is the government's decision to do double tax on people who own companies. You own the company is taxed, and then you're taxed afterwards. It discourages business from being ethical in their finances when they are taxed too highly. It encourages both loopholes and get-arounds. And that's not healthy for the tax base or for the economy. And the result is clearly visible. So what should the government do if they shouldn't be taxing these sort of things? Oddly enough, in early America there was no income tax, and yet they had roads and everything else they needed. You see, when it comes to taxation for infrastructure and those basic things that government provides, you don't actually need that much tax. And the result is that the economy grows and more people have jobs. Donald Trump in America, for instance, has massively deregulated the market and reduced taxes, and they need more workers than they have. And that's quite something. Imagine being in that economic situation. It gives workers a lot of power to negotiate better salaries. And unfortunately, we have the opposite approach in South Africa of tax, tax, tax. Why are we taxing? Well, one of the reasons is the various social security net systems. The RAF is one, where you get to sue the RAF for money if you're in a car accident, only if it's beyond a certain degree of pain and suffering, where you have permanent damage to parts of your body likely, because the government at some stage decided that they needed to foot the bill of car accidents because it was too expensive for someone to bear, instead of doing what some rational governments have done and saying, well, you want to drive a car, you need to get third-party insurance to cover any accidents and possibly to cover injuries to the other party. Instead, we have this massive government system with what I covered before, which is rent-seeking. And there's this whole complex system to try and get money through and out of the government, and the RAF is completely bankrupt. And yet you continue to have this RAF funded from fuel, which makes it harder to do business in South Africa and harder to make a living and harder to get by, really, which stifles the economy and causes suffering. The other thing that our taxes do is pay an over-bloated civil service, where jobs are created not because they are needed as they are creating business, but in order to give people jobs. They're invented. And our massive civil service takes a lot of tax to maintain. And unfortunately, they're not creating economic value as a result of their over-bloated public service. And the result, unfortunately, is that the economy suffers, because that economic value which they could be creating if they were in the private sector, these individuals are not creating. And so it reduces the economy of South Africa. You then have our social states. Now, the interesting thing about a social state is it doesn't reduce poverty. The statistics are there. Where you have a social state, in fact, people remain in poverty. Now, it's important to be charitable and to help the poor, but when you're taking money out of the most productive citizens' pockets, which they could be spending on hiring people to do jobs for them, and instead you're putting it into social grants, well, again, you're pushing the economy backwards, and you're increasing inequality and making more people reliant on the state, instead of reliant on jobs they could be having from that same exact money. And the same works for your minimum wage. You have a minimum wage which essentially says, I can't hire you if I don't value your labor more than the minimum wage. And the result, when it was introduced for domestic workers, was mass firings or retrenchments, to put it correctly. And the result, when it was introduced in the agricultural sector, was the same. People who earn small amounts of money are able to put that money towards something and to grow themselves and to gradually move up the ladder, which is what happens with sweatshops even in other countries. But people who can't earn any money at all become reliant on the state and become despondent and are unable to get the money to improve themselves and improve their lot in life. All of this comes together in state intervention in the economy. You have the state taxing very heavily to support a social state, which is a massive social state, and which ever increases because the money which should be growing the economy, which should be spent on salaries, instead it goes through social grants to the same people who would be getting it from salaries, but going through a massive system of taxation which takes the money out of the economy, and going through a massive civil service and all the rest of it. And unfortunately in South Africa we haven't spent enough on infrastructure, the very thing which government should have its primary focus on. You don't have the electricity supply which benefits industry, you don't have the roads which benefit industry. You have a system in South Africa, unfortunately, where the state is pushing the economy down, and as a result the state's getting less money out of the economy as well. And that's a problem. we have gone from being a country with terrible legislative inequality, and we did add some legislative inequality on the opposite end, which for some people has been devastated, and yet despite that, the inequality remains in the same direction it was, and it's worsened as compared to how it was. And that's largely as a result of government policies which have pushed South Africa to the degree where we are told by international organizations that we are now the most unequal nation on earth. And that's not to say that previous systems were good, they weren't. They were dreadful. It's to say that when government intervenes too much in an economy, unfortunately it gets sent downhill. And so if you're feeling the bite of those petrol increases and you're not going out to dinner, and that waiter is not getting the money from you going out to dinner, and you're feeling the bite of the petrol increases, so you're not buying chocolate, and the chocolate seller is going out of business, you can start to see the problem with overtaxation and the fact that it is not the wealthy, the target of overtaxation, who are being hurt. It's everyone who is being hurt. And so when you fill your car up with petrol and you're paying a third of that amount roundabout on tax, and you just can't afford it, and so you're not going out except for to work, and you're not doing all of these things, remember that this isn't necessary. It's not needed. We have a system where we have this illusion where we're told that these things are needed. But in fact, most of what those taxes are being spent on are in fact impoverishing the people they're supposed to be helping.